me. Can you hear me all? Wonderful. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the current diagnosis is mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. It turns out that the classification for Alzheimer's disease has gone quite a bit of revision in the last 10 years, and in the sense of emphasizing now the preclinical aspects, so the mild cognitive syndromes that precede overt dementia, but also the biomarker states that precede cognitive impairment. And so the classification has become quite complicated. And that complication, I think, is designed to help to facilitate earlier diagnosis, but will also make early diagnosis. Will also make early diagnosis a more challenging thing in parts of the world where there are resource deficiencies. As we all know, the global prevalence. This is the latest forecast from the Global Burden of Disease Group. So the prevalence of dementia is projected to rise to top 75 million by the year 2050, and most of that growth, as you can see from the red parts of the map, are expected to be in Africa, in northern and sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in parts of the Middle East and some parts of Asia. And this is supposed to be like a 300 to 400 fold increase in many areas. So the current burden is going to be disproportionately distributed to these parts of the world. Much of that burden can be attributed to population growth and to people in those parts of the world, and to improving life expectancies in those parts of the world. So in that sense, it's a product of demographics. But we also know, and you can see the yellow aspects of the bar graphs. There are changes that we anticipate are due to modifiable risk factors, mostly things to do with diet, health, general physical, in particular metabolic and cardiovascular health, and also to background, social background, poverty, and education. So there are opportunities in this for intervention. So a number of years, I think it was about 5 years ago, the Lancet Commission put forward an update regarding the risk factors for dementia in the population, and in particular the modifiable risk factors, those that apply in early life, things like poor education and hearing deficiencies, head trauma, things that happen in midlife, including alcohol. The latest addition one of the latest additions is alcohol consumption, and then climate change and environmental pollution. And there are also factors that have to do with late life, and those are so you can see, if you can see the graphic well, I hope you can. Most of these things are the usual suspects: social isolation, low education, things that adversely impact cardiovascular health, and then head trauma. We also know that in some families there are hereditary causes of dementia. With Alzheimer's disease, this would be the mutations in the presenilins 1 and 2 genes in the APP gene. Other major dementias also have autosomal dominant mutations. So most dementias are caused by autosomal dominant mutations. But we also know that there are genetic risk factors that are not mutations, and the most important, and this has been known for some time, is the apolipoprotein E4 allele. Well, it turns out that looking at different population groups in Africa, and you can see on the slide, groups from Nigeria, from South Africa, from Kenya, from the Republic of Benin, from South Africa, you can find that consistently it has been shown that, at least in the vast majority of studies, it's been shown that the apolipoprotein E4 allele does not predict dementia in people of African heritage. Similar findings have been demonstrated in the United States for African American populations, although those findings are mixed. That might have to do with the degree of racial admixture that is observed here versus in Africa. Recently, about 3 years ago, there was an ancestry analysis study that identified allele on the chromosome 19 that appears to explain some of this resilience. This allele is found in about 12% of people of African heritage. It varies depending on where you are looking in Africa. But as you can see from the chart below, having one allele significantly protects, having this allele, this allele interacts with the apolipoprotein E4. So if, for example, if you have, the level of protection increases depending on whether you're homozygous versus heterozygous for the ApoE4 allele. Now, given that it's distributed to a relatively small number of the population, there's this sense that there are other risk factors, other genetic risk factors. And there's high genetic diversity, very high. It's actually the highest in the world in Africa compared to other regions of the world. Genetic diversity is very high, and you can see that in the various panels. And that is in contrast to groups from other parts of the world, for example, from Europe, from Asia. You can see relative homogeneity, even in the American groups, Mayans, Incas. There's very relatively low genetic diversity compared to what is observed in Africa across the various regions. And so there's much work to be done. Very little of it is happening currently, but work has begun. So this graphic just shows, just brings into sharp relief the scarcity, if you will, of research, of investigations into both the epidemiology of dementia as well as the genetics. You can see from the map on your right that there are precious few prevalent studies of dementia in Africa. Now, the map also shows you many countries, and taking Nigeria in particular, which is this one, there are about 300 ethnic groups in Nigeria. And so there's quite a bit of diversity, social, cultural, and even genetic within most of these countries. And so this is a challenge. For planning policy purposes, it makes sense to try to understand the frequency of dementia in Africa and in whole countries. But from the point of view of understanding ancestral background and its contributions, one is going to have to go population by population, so there's much to be done. The very definitions of dementia, that's always a challenge. As I alluded to in the beginning, the change in definition of dementia undermines some of the figures we have, because most of those are based on overt dementia, and at least the work that's been done in Africa hasn't taken into account, in general, MCI. There are a few studies that have looked at MCI, but most have not considered MCI and preclinical states. There's limited expertise, that's been alluded to in the interview earlier. Limited expertise for diagnosis, for care, for research. Along with that, there are knowledge barriers, there's stigma, there are religio-magical belief systems that undermine recognition in the community. The stigma doesn't just affect the people who live with dementia or their relatives or their community. It also affects the providers, because the providers come from those communities. So they share the same stigma. So there is a challenge improving recognition. There's limited infrastructure, technology for diagnostic or research purposes. There's low investment in research. Much of the research investment, and that was increasing recently until this year, research investment in Africa in dementia research in Africa had been increasing. There's been a sharp drop-off lately. That's come with the new administration and a change in direction from the new administration. But we see opportunities. We see opportunities to plug expertise gaps. So one of the ways in which people have tried to plug expertise gaps is by identifying talent in various parts of the world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in places where there's low and middle income countries. Bring those people here, train them up, have them go back. And we're finding that hasn't been particularly successful. First of all, they come here and they get stuck. They see shiny objects, they want to stay, or they find love and they stay. And so that has not been a very successful model. There have been people who've gone back and done great work, but typically what that does is it facilitates a brain drain. So in our view, the way to build capacity is, firstly, you have to have a capacity building orientation. You have to have the idea that you're not going there with a cape to be Superman or Superwoman, but rather to empower people to be able to take the mantle once you've helped them get started. You need local partners, therefore you need projects on the ground, because it's those projects that form the incubators. You train people with projects. And it obviously requires international collaboration, because we have to lend our expertise, we have to bring resources. And then we require accessible training platforms, and I'll tell you an example of that as we go along. So there are also, where some of the work that is happening now is leveraging existing, to get around the infrastructure problems, leveraging investments in primary care, both local and international, and then using simpler and adaptable approaches. And then lately, we're beginning to work on portable technologies, MRI, EEG, body sensors, which everyone is familiar with here, to try to bridge these gaps. Now, an important thing that has to happen to make the work proceed is to navigate with care the cultural context. And this means, sometimes it means legitimacy through community engagement. It means adapting your measures to local languages, to local culture. Same thing goes for the interventions that one seeks to implement. And the opportunity here for moving the needle, the early opportunity is to target these modifiable risk factors, childhood education. There are people who are emphasizing what they call brain capital, and the idea that brain capital is developed from childhood or from very early in childhood, and that includes nutrition and education. So there are some low-hanging fruit, if you will. The high genetic diversity provides an opportunity to begin to do deep dives into how ancestral backgrounds influences how dementia is expressed, and to contrast that with other populations so that we can really begin to tease apart nature versus nurture in the genesis of dementia. We also have so far not really begun to, now we're in an era where we can diagnose affirmatively Alzheimer's disease using blood-based or CSF biomarkers and imaging scans with ligands that stick to amyloid and tau. But we haven't calibrated these biomarkers, particularly the fluid-based biomarkers in African populations, and we have reason to believe that there'll be some variation. So we've been involved lately with a project in northern Nigeria, in 2 states in northern Nigeria, together with a population of about just under 10 million. The northeastern region of Nigeria, which encompasses a couple of other states, has about 22 million people, over 20 ethnic groups. And in these 2 states, there are close to 10 different ethnic groups, and with significant differences. For example, in the northeasternmost corner of Borno State, we have the Shua Arabs, who most Shua Arabs are distributed outside Nigeria, but there's a substantial population within Nigeria. And they are actually more related to Arabs from the Middle East in terms of appearance, genetics, culture, than they are, say, to Nigerians from the Southeast. But anyway, this is where we are. We have now a longitudinal study that is designed to do multi-level characterization, clinical, blood-based, CSF biomarker studies. We will do radiological imaging brain imaging in a subset of cases, and the goal is biobanking. Mahmoud Meina, who's a key collaborator and has set up much of the infrastructure in the Northeast, the BioRTC is actually a laboratory that is capable of generating stem cells from skin fibroblasts, and that center is his brainchild. So the goal here is to establish a deeply phenotyped cohort, develop and share an open access iPSC biobank from this cohort, which will be the first in Africa. Use these models, these iPSC models, to examine how ancestry and ApoE variants distinctly shape Alzheimer's disease phenotypes in the iPSC models and ultimately in the population. And so far, this work has been supported by the TAL Consortium, the Wellcome Trust, which is in the UK, and it's not mentioned here, but lately the Alzheimer's Association. So, as part of this, we have a consortium of the BioRTC, 2 specialist hospitals, 2 teaching hospitals. We've done an audit of the dementia cases at the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital in Maiduguri. This was published earlier this year. And so over a period of since 2009 to present, they have documented 1,216 cases, close to 50-50 male-female, from different corners of the state, as you can see, well, mostly from the central parts of the state, as you can see here, and primarily from Maiduguri, which is the capital area. The majority, as you might predict, have Alzheimer's disease. Vascular dementia has also been diagnosed, but then there are others, including frontotemporal dementia. As you would predict, and this is well known, social status is related to dementia. So these are basically unskilled labor, petty traders, porters, and then you have the semi-skilled people, drivers, cooks. You have the people who are in desk jobs. You have the professionals and so on. And so the dementia, as you move up the social or occupational ladder, the dementia frequency drops dramatically. And this here shows you distributions. The Kanuri are the dominant ethnic group in northeastern Nigeria. So that's why there are many more of them in the sample. But as you can see, when you look at the male-female distribution and you look at we didn't break down the percentages in this graphic, unfortunately. But we are not seeing a higher frequency in any particular ethnic group. And we're not seeing any male-female differences in any of the ethnic groups. We are finding that the usual clinical correlates are the same: depression, hypertension. We find that there's a reasonably high the frequency of neuropsychiatric disturbances comparable to what you find here in dementia populations. So far, we haven't found any clinical characteristics, at least in this sample, that would stand out compared to what is observed in the United States. And it turns out that they're getting the same, with the exception that they're not, anti-amyloid therapy is not yet available because of costs. The treatments are largely the same, antidepressants and neuroleptics when needed, either to deal with anxiety, depression, agitation, and so forth. And so this just gives you a snapshot that the cases are there. We're doing recruitment in a two-pronged, or what you might call a mixed sampling frame. So we're going to recruit from the clinics, starting in particular with the Maiduguri clinic, and then we're going to screen from the population, a random sample. As I mentioned, we have a complex governance structure, including genetics, advisors. So it's a very deep, well thought out plan. The top left image is the Emir. So we met with the Emir in July as we were launching the project. And next to that, you see the field workers. That's me at the lectern training the field workers. What we were doing is screening with a mini cog. We needed something quick and easy that we could train lay interviewers to use in the community. This was translated into Kanuri. It's translated into Hausa. It was translated into Hausa, which everyone speaks. And we're planning to translate it into Kanuri. Actually, we were planning at that time to translate it to Kanuri. That's been done. And what you can see next to that is people training to do skin biopsies. We also met with community leaders and with the Community Advisory Board. And later on, Dr. Udunda Anazodo, who's at McGill University, came by and trained the radiologists, which is what you see, which you can see her at the training. So we've done community engagement at the level of leadership, the Emir, the government, at the level of basic ward-to-ward community leaders, and we've trained field workers. We actually went out into the community right after the training and did a real-world test of the training skills, and then debriefed afterwards. Today, 3 months later, they've screened 1,000 people, just over 1,000 people. About a third of them are positive screens. We expect some error with the mini-cog, so we're going to take a random sample of the negative screens and examine them. We have direct enrollments from the clinic, 49. Those numbers will pick up in time. It's understandably slower because with the community screening, we're going into the communities. With the enrollments in the clinic, they're coming to us, but we intend to beat the bushes. So far, all these people have contributed skin biopsies and bloods, and the clinic-based cases have contributed blood samples. So at this point in time, in terms of the grants, we've already met the skin biopsy targets. Brain MRI scans will be scheduled later once we have that up and running. So this is Udunda Nazodo. She's been doing a lot of work building image acquisition and analysis in Nigeria. The Connexing curriculum, and I gave a lecture there a few weeks ago, is basically an online, similar to, I forget what it's called. It's a free online course that people around the continent can enroll in, and they get to be trained on image coding, image analysis, detailed aspects of image acquisition, image analysis, coding, and so on. So it's a very vibrant online community. And what she's doing is essentially trying to democratize brain imaging in Africa. That's her mantra. What she's also doing, which I don't show on this slide, is she's building in her lab in Montreal portable MRIs. I think this will be about 0.25 or 5 Tesla. The prototype machines today can be plugged into the wall. They don't magnetize, so you won't have the risk of pulling out fillings or anything of the sort. So this creates a possibility of plug and play imaging in the clinic. In the preliminary data that I've seen, this technology can produce diagnostic quality images. Research quality obviously it won't be the same thing as say 3 Tesla imaging, but it's a start. We're also, as I mentioned, collecting blood samples. We also intend to collect saliva samples so that we can try to do biomarker analysis in saliva. Thomas Karikari, who's been a leader in the development of blood-based biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, has put together a protocol to experiment with simpler handling processes. We wanted to find out if we can do blood sport analyses or use slimmed down handling processes and storage processes so that we can get around technology barriers. And Chiadi Onyike has been looking very closely at salivary biomarkers. Last year, we visited a number of the vendors to have discussions about how we might try to implement validation in Africa. Now, I've been working with people in engineering here, so Dr. Sri Samar's group has developed a novel way, I think Ross Magolis, you're collaborating with them as well, has developed functional connectivity analytic approaches for analyzing EEG data that might actually render functional connectivity maps that are reminiscent of FDG PET images. So that's essentially what you see here. I can't go too much into detail into the methods. This was a convenient sample of people with FTD, AD, and normal controls. But what you can see is that we are able to render distinct maps. So this shows, these are the cases with frontotemporal dementia. There are many of them, about 30 cases, and the images from subject to subject were surprisingly uniform. There was more variability with the Alzheimer's disease cases, but clear distinction from the FTD cases. So what this means is that we could potentially use EEG in lieu of PET, FDG PET, in these communities. It will bring 2 advantages. Firstly, it's plug and play. You can send machines to people. You can send the machines into the field. You can also do repeated images, repeated measures, which opens up longitudinal functional connectivity analyses. Now, in terms of intervention, the first major clinical trial has launched. This is focused, this is Chiudemomo's work using the Africa Fingers model, basically inspired by the concepts of brain resilience and cognitive reserve. And what she's basically doing is targeting the modifiable risk factors, as I mentioned earlier. This is the schematic. So the idea is you'll target diet, so nutrition, exercise, cognitive stimulation, and then address the cardiovascular and metabolic risk factors. So that's what fingers means. This is going to be, these interventions will be measured clinically and also in terms of their impact on molecular indices of illness and on radiological indices of illness. So people recruited age 50 to 85 in, right now in several African countries, so in different parts of Africa, but starting first in Nigeria and Kenya. This is just another way of laying out the same study. So there'll be a baseline assessment and then assessments at 3 other time points with interventions interleaved. And the interventions can be, the design is such that interventions can be locally modified. For example, when we were having the community advisory board meetings in northern Nigeria, there was a dance activity that was designed in Kenya. And when we met with these Muslim leaders, they said, we're not doing those dances. So we've had to come up with things that are culturally acceptable. And so there will be some variation site to site in how this is implemented. And we've already started recruiting for this. This I mentioned already. So basically, dementia research is coming of age in Africa. I've shown you a subset, not the whole, of the kinds of longitudinal studies that are using multifaceted approaches to characterize dementia in various populations. There's similar work in South Africa, for example. There's similar work in Francophone, in French-speaking Africa. There's some other work in Northern Africa as well. These projects are becoming sites, if you will, for biomarker development. We now have a large population-based risk factor intervention that, and then we'll see how that goes, but it will become the basis for working out methods, at least for working out methods for doing this kind of work, large-scale trials in Africa. Because at some point we're going to be moving towards pharmacological trials, and it will be good to have local know-how baked in. So this can also be thought of as training the investigators, the local capacity. So this research has been consciously aligned with knowledge transfer and with capacity building, because the idea is that in the long run we want this to be locally sustainable. We want it to be not entirely dependent on funds transferred from here, on people bringing grants from here and bringing expertise from here to do that work. And I think recent political developments have made clear why it is advisable, in fact necessary, to have local capacity. We're developing new approaches and technologies to bridge cultural and infrastructural hurdles. I mentioned that. And we do believe that the genetic diversity presents a tremendous opportunity to understand genetics of Alzheimer's disease, not just in Africa, but through comparative analysis elsewhere in the world. So I hope I have given a good representation of the kind of work, of this excitement that we have, of why we're excited about what is happening in terms of dementia research in Africa today. I'm acknowledging with this slide the various contributors to what is happening today. Thank you. Take your questions.
Wow, that is a great project. I love that you're doing that, and I agree with you. There are all kinds of reasons to be excited about it. Let me ask a clinical question, which is, did you find, in the surveys of dementia in Northeast Nigeria, were there many reversible cases found? Was the rate of B12 deficiency, for example, as a cause of dementia higher than in the U.S., or was it really not much different?
Well, yeah, so it's a great question. Because this was retrospective analysis, we didn't have enough laboratory test data to really get at that kind of question. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a different question then,
Yeah.
since you don't have anything on that. On the Fingers Project,
Yes.
you alluded to this issue of the cultural elements of that. Did there need to be a lot of fine-tuning, tailoring the interventions to fit the cultural milieu?
In northern Nigeria, yes. I would imagine that if we were doing this in southern Nigeria, the methods that were used in Kenya would have been more readily adaptable. Maybe we would have had to change the music. We would clearly have had to change the language. But we could have used essentially the same kinds of stimuli. But in the north, because of the influence of Islam and the fact that many African societies are very religious, we can't use certain types of activities. For one thing, you can't, some aspects in Islam, dancing is not necessarily encouraged. Secondly, men dancing with women is an issue, unless you're married. So there are a number of, the degree of tweaking will depend on where you are doing the implementation. Right now it's Nigeria and Kenya. And I think we have two other sites. The Finger study has two other sites in southern Nigeria. Those, I think, will mirror what is happening in Kenya more closely. And then we'll have an opportunity to see, I think, if changing we'll be able to have contrast what we're doing with the changes that we're making in the north. I think we'll be able to look at the impact of that.
Great. Thanks, Chad.
Sure.
Folks have questions? Dr. Bray.
Well, no evidence, but that's because those questions haven't been posed. There's no investigation of anti-amyloid therapy in Africa that I know of. So we won't know until we actually look at it.
Great.
Yes, I think the challenge, I think, is cost and then the infrastructure. Some of the companies are now, I think, lecanemab will soon be subcutaneous. There's a subcutaneous formulation that's about to be evaluated by the FDA. That will substantially reduce the cost because it eliminates the need for infusions and the infrastructure that goes with infusions. So it makes it significantly cheaper. I think in time, these anti-amyloid treatments are going to be delivered in forms that significantly reduce the cost. And as you know, some of the cost is R&D related. So
That's interesting.
there might be ways to get around that. That would be both, political policy, but also in time, the patents will. We don't want to wait for patents to expire, so we'll have to find some political solutions.
Dr. Margolis.
Yes, it's a terrific question. We don't know yet. But I can posit some some ideas. The first is that, the test, we're still in the process of developing, this is retrospective data. They basically use the MMSE translated to Hausa. I think there's a possibility that the impact of the illiteracy is not uncommon in this area. So the impact of illiteracy on the testing performance and on the evaluation has probably been underestimated. So I think there is that issue, and we've run into this already in the screening, and we're trying to work out how to get around it because we don't want to have too many false positives. So that's one potential contributor. Regarding the, but we won't take it for granted that that's the primary explanation. So we do intend to, when we have enough data, to look at other potential explanations. Nutritional status, childhood nutrition, for example, is not something you can take for granted in these parts of the world. So that might be a factor. And unfortunately, poverty undermines education, but it also undermines nutrition in the developmental phases. So that question will be harder to tease out because we would have to probably do it prospectively and in a focused study, I think.
Thanks. Other questions, Dr. DePaulo?
It's preliminary. It's one study. It needs to be replicated is the first thing. Lithium has been, people have been thinking about lithium for some time. There have been a number of studies in different neurodegenerative diseases, sometimes prescribing the doses used to treat affective disorder and running into trouble with confusion and tremor. Other studies looking at lower doses, and the results have been mixed. I think a study recently completed at Columbia did not find evidence that it helps, but they were looking at people with dementia. Now, whether it has some preventive value, there's been some evidence, I would call it preliminary, that it might be neuroprotective. Now, we haven't thought of lithium as a trace element, the way we think about zinc and others. Perhaps it is, I don't know. So there'll have to be, I think more work is required to clarify if lithium is a trace element.
I'll just add, you know vastly more than I do. My sense is that there probably a whole lot more work does need to be done before that could be established that would be helpful. The one note I would add, though, is that because lithium has been around so long as a generic drug, it is on the essential drugs list of the World Health Organization. It's a very, very, very inexpensive medication all over the world. So if, in fact, it were helpful, it would be incredibly affordable.
Absolutely, yes. This is true.
Other questions? If not, thank you so much, Dr. Onyike, for terrific.
Thank you.